Every morning, millions of people stand in line for a drink they could make at home in under 2 minutes. They don't need to. They have a kettle. They have instant coffee. Some of them have espresso machines sitting unused in their own kitchens. And yet they wait, in cars, in lines that wrap around parking lots, for a cup of coffee that by most blind taste comparisons isn't even rated as anyone's favorite. So what are they actually waiting for? The answer isn't in the cup. It's in a decision one man made in a back alley in Milan more than 40 years ago. A decision that had almost nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with a question most companies never think to ask. What if people aren't buying a product at all? What if they're buying a place to belong? By the end of this video, you won't just understand why Starbucks became a global empire, you'll understand why it could never have happened with better coffee alone. Here's the part that should stop you. Coffee is one of the highest margin drinks in the restaurant industry. Roasted beans, water, and milk cost a small fraction of what a customer pays at the counter. That's not a Starbucks secret. It's the economics of coffee everywhere, from gas stations to five-star hotels. Which means Starbucks was never competing on the price of the bean. It couldn't be. Almost every coffee shop on the planet has access to the same basic economics. So if it isn't the coffee and it isn't really the price, something else has to be doing the heavy lifting. Something that convinces a customer that paying more for a cup of coffee is not just acceptable, but worth it. To find that something, we have to go back to a moment long before Starbucks became the company we know today, back to when it wasn't a cafe at all. In 1982, Howard Schultz joined Starbucks as Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. At the time, Starbucks wasn't selling drinks. It was a small Seattle retailer with a handful of stores selling whole coffee beans and equipment to people who brewed coffee at home. There was no espresso bar, there was no grab and go, there wasn't even a menu of drinks to order. A year later, Schultz traveled to Milan for a housewares trade show. What he encountered there had nothing to do with the trip's agenda. He walked into an Italian espresso bar and watched something unfold that he hadn't expected. Baristas knew customers by name. Regulars lingered instead of rushing out. Strangers struck up conversations at the counter. The espresso itself was almost secondary to what was happening around it. A ritual repeated daily that people organized parts of their lives around. Schultz later described it as discovering the romance and the theater of espresso, but the detail that stayed with him wasn't the theater, it was the community. He returned to Seattle and pitched his bosses on an idea: turn Starbucks into a place people could gather, not just a shop where they bought beans to take home. The founders said no. They believed Starbucks should stay a coffee retailer, not become a restaurant. Rejected but not convinced he was wrong, Schultz left in 1985 and started his own espresso bar concept, Il Giornale, built directly on what he'd seen in Milan. It worked well enough that 2 years later, in 1987, Schultz raised the money to buy Starbucks outright and merge it with his vision. That vision had a name, though Schultz didn't invent it. He borrowed it from sociologist Ray Oldenburg, who had spent years studying the informal public spaces where communities used to gather: barbershops, pubs, corner stores, places that weren't home and weren't work, but something people needed anyway. Oldenburg called them third places and warned that modern life was losing them. Schultz didn't just build coffee shops, he built an industrial-scale replacement for something sociology said America had quietly lost. That reframing from beverage company to belonging company is the single decision that built everything that followed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it in a single detail of how Starbucks actually operates. Start with your name on the cup. It seems like an operational detail, a way to track orders in a busy store, but psychologically it does something else. Hearing your own name spoken aloud triggers attention and a sense of recognition. It's part of why people notice their name in a noisy room faster than almost anything else, a well-documented effect researchers call the cocktail party effect. Starbucks doesn't need your name to make your drink. It uses your name because being recognized even briefly by a stranger produces a small hit of social validation, the sense of being seen. That single interaction repeats every time you order, and repetition is where habits form. Behavioral researchers, most notably Charles Duhigg in his work on habit formation, describe habits as a loop. A cue triggers a routine, and the routine delivers a reward which reinforces the cue. For a regular Starbucks customer, the cue might be a stressful morning or a familiar drive. The routine is the order. The reward isn't only caffeine, it's the comfort of doing something familiar in a familiar space with a predictable outcome. Predictability matters more than people realize. A Starbucks in Tokyo and a Starbucks in Toronto are built to feel almost identical. Same chairs, same lighting temperature, same drink names, same cup sizes. That consistency isn't a lack of creativity. It's choice architecture, a term popularized by economist Richard Thaler, the deliberate design of an environment to guide behavior without restricting it. Every layout decision, from where the pastries sit to how the line curves to the register, nudges customers towards specific choices while feeling like no one is nudging them at all. And then there's the price itself, which behaves less like a coffee price and more like a status signal. Economists have long studied goods that become more desirable, not less, as their price rises, a pattern first described by economist Thorsten Veblen, who noted that certain purchases exist partly to display status rather than pure function. A $5 customized latte ordered exactly to your specifications functions the same way. It's not just a drink. It's a small, repeatable, affordable way to signal that you have the means and the moment to treat yourself. None of these ideas exist in isolation. They stack. Recognition builds comfort. Comfort builds habit. Habit builds identity. And somewhere in that stack, a customer stops thinking of Starbucks as a place they visit and starts thinking of it as a place they belong to. Here's where Schultz's decision from the 1980s becomes a deliberate, repeatable system. Unlike many retail chains that expanded through franchising, Starbucks grew primarily by owning and operating its own stores. That choice is easy to overlook, but it mattered enormously. Franchising trades control for speed. Franchisees run their own stores their own way. By keeping stores company-operated, Starbucks kept total control over training, design, and the customer experience, down to small details: how drinks are called out, how baristas are trained to interact with regulars, how stores are laid out to encourage lingering rather than rushing. That control turned every store into a controlled environment for reinforcing the same psychological pattern everywhere at scale. The company wasn't just selling a drink in 10,000 locations, it was replicating a specific emotional experience in 10,000 locations and refining it constantly based on what worked. This is also where identity-based marketing enters the picture. Starbucks doesn't primarily advertise the coffee itself, the beans, the roast, the origin story of the bean. It markets the identity of the person holding the cup, someone who has a usual, someone who customizes their order to their exact taste, someone who treats a weekday morning as worth a small indulgence. The product became a prop in a story customers were already telling themselves. And because that story is emotional rather than purely functional, it's far more resistant to competition. A cheaper coffee down the street competes on price. It cannot easily compete on 20 years of a customer's routine, comfort, and sense of recognition built inside a specific set of stores. That's not an accident of good branding. It's the direct compounding result of a decision made in Milan in 1983, turned over decades into an operating system. So the coffee was never really the product, it was the entry fee. What Starbucks actually sells is a small, reliable dose of recognition, a place where a stranger says your name, remembers your order, and gives you 5 minutes that feel like they belong to you. For the price of a latte, that feeling is available on nearly every corner in the world. That's the real reason the drive-through line doesn't move faster and nobody seems to mind.
Because in the end, the most valuable thing a $5 cup of coffee can buy isn't caffeine. It's 20 seconds of feeling like someone in this world actually knows your name. And if a coffee company can sell belonging instead of beans, imagine what other billion-dollar businesses are really selling.